Okay, so
Tell your friends the same things.
it says that we're live.
July. Yep.
Let's see, new channel,
I never know what this is.
Zooms, live.
Yeah, YouTube.
It's not showing that it's coming up.
Assignment, whatever that one's called, is due. Or next. I didn't even start on that. I have the first part of that one. That doesn't stress me out. Cause he just always sending those updates and I'm like, I haven't finished anything, so.
Just give me 1 second. Hopefully it will.
Stressing me out.
Just want to make sure,
It's
because
just
the
like.
microphone's not showing that it's picking up anything.
Calm down. I have a lot of other stuff. I know. To take my marketing management exam today, and I'm just not. I don't study really. I just like I'll just go with this. I always had a study on that.
It just looks like we've
It's not
got.
happening. That's why
Okay.
there's this like practice.
So just as sort of a
So I don't
recap
know.
of where we are, we have talked about logic and critical thinking in here and how to make logical arguments about ethics. And then we moved into ancient ethical thought, beginning with Socrates and Plato. And then we have talked about some challenges to ethics, beginning with the modern challenges to ethics, and then some postmodern challenges to ethics. And so I think I asked you, when does the modern world start? When does modernity begin? And we got some answers to that. Generally speaking, most historians, just as a recap, say that modernity begins in the Renaissance and the Quattrocento. And from a philosophical standpoint, it starts with the writings of Niccolo Bernardo de Machiavelli, who discusses the way in which ethics in the secular world is divorced from the religious, right? And so that's what makes it really modern, is that he divorces ethics and morality and politics in particular from sort of religious thought. This leads to, the wheels of doubt starting to turn, and then we get to postmodern thought. And when does postmodern thought, if modern thought begins in the Quattrocento, when does postmodern thought begin, and why is that important? Well, because subjectivism and psychological egoism largely rely on postmodern thought, and that begins with the writings of Friedrich Nietzsche. And Nietzsche is writing at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And in many ways, he's prophetic in that he sort of predicts what's going to happen. If you went back in time to that period, and from a marketing standpoint, this was a period of enormous marketing innovation at the beginning of the 20th century and the start of the Industrial Revolution. And people were really, really optimistic about the ability of science to sort of solve all of man's problems. And Nietzsche looks around and says, like, you people are crazy. This is not. And I can tell you what I think Nietzsche says. He's one of the most debated, I think, writers in terms of philosophical ethics that we have. And so other people will tell you that my perspective may be wrong, I'm sure. But what I think he says is, he looks around and says, look, the world is not getting better. The world is really, really dangerous. And it's getting more and more scary. And in hindsight, I think Nietzsche is right. We go back to that period when the Industrial Revolution starts, and we see enormous optimism, this belief that we're going to be able to cure all kinds of diseases. For the first time in history, they get antibiotics, and that makes a huge leap forward. But we also, as a result of the Industrial Revolution, come up with ways of killing each other in highly effective mechanistic ways, right? Warfare becomes far more brutal as a result of all of this. And Nietzsche says, look, the world is getting darker, and this leads to subjectivism and psychological egoism, right? And we talked about subjectivism, the belief that ethics is always in the individual. Psychological egoism, which is the one that I said is the most difficult to deal with, it doesn't seem true, but it actually is the more difficult one than subjectivism or cultural relativism to dispense with, because if you think about it, can you will yourself to not want what you want, right? Well, the problems with psychological egoism, and the reason that we can dispense with it, is that it says that human beings always behave in a certain way, and anytime we start to say that people always behave in this fashion or that fashion, they're always acting selfishly, well, that becomes problematic, because people are oftentimes very conflicted in the choices that they have to make, right? And it doesn't tell us how to deal with that when we have conflicts. It also conflates, and it engages in the fallacy of equivocation, in that it conflates two things, right? So if you ask a psychological egoist, surely Mother Teresa is not selfish, they would say, yes, she is, because she's just getting good feelings from what she's doing. Mother Teresa's dead now, so I guess she's not doing anything. But when she was alive, they would have said, Mother Teresa is selfish. She's just doing what she wants to do because she probably gets, a feeling of self-worth and self-actualization from helping the world's sickest and poorest among us, right? Well, that the equivocation is that it relies on the emotions that follow an act and conflates them with the motivation for that act, which are not necessarily the same thing. But these challenges pop up all the time. And in business, we particularly see people relying on the cultural relativist position to argue that we should accept certain business practices in certain parts of the world that are probably not ethical, right? So we have to dispense with those. What are the problems that are associated with these? Why is this not changing? With these challenges. Again, I apologize for not being able to launch the program, but I've tried. I tried again this morning to get it to stop playing the slides and advancing, and it does. So I just have to kind of go with it like this. I should probably take the slides out, but if you wanted the narrated PowerPoints, it creates another problem. So the problems associated with the challenges to ethics is that they allow for extreme exceptions in ethical thought. They are not based on reason. They are purely emotive. And as a result, they don't allow for the development of universal principles. So not based on reason, allow for exceptions, and as a result, we can't come up with universal principles that will apply to all people at all places at all times. So what are the elements of a valid ethical theory? Well, valid ethical theories like Republic, like Plato's Republic, Aristotle's virtue ethics. We talked about Aristotle, right? And the means between extremes in here, didn't we? Can we talk about that? Talk about virtue. Okay. Well, I'll go back over that. The elements of a valid ethical theory, it's based on rational analysis. So we're going to use reason, and this is where ethics does become more objective, right? One of the things that it seems to be true with the challenges are that ethics doesn't seem to be like mathematics. But if we use logic and we use rational analysis, we can come up with principles upon which we have a firm foundation. So it allows for the development of principles, and those can be universally applicable. Now, when we talk about the valid ethical theories, Aristotle's virtue ethics, Platonic thought in Republic, it's not that there aren't problems with that, right? But they meet these minimum requirements. Every ethical theory that we'll discuss has things that may be improved upon. And that is not to say that we can't debate the merits of those, but that because it meets these three, we can say that this is a foundation upon which we can build a ethical platform, recognizing that there are limitations. And I don't think that we should take that as fatally flawed, because if we think about really serious debates in, for example, physics, there are areas of debate in physics. Even the hardest of the sciences seems to have areas where there are disagreements among scholars. So we can't have too high, we can't set the bar too high and then just, collapse it in on itself and say, well, because, we have a lot of disagreements, because there are these problems, we shouldn't at least think about these things in a very serious way, right? So building on the works of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, what are the modern ethical theories that we can talk about? The one that business students like the most is called utilitarian ethics. And the reason that business students like this one the most is because it's the one that most of business education is predicated upon. In economic terms, we talk about the free market and the idea of economic utility. Now, what is economic utility? Well, economists will tell you that what we should get is we should maximize our scarce resources. And how do we do that? Well, by allocating them among those people who are most willing to pay for the resource. They will put it to the highest and best use in classical economic theory. So what does this mean? Well, from an individual, again, one of the things that I try to do in all of my classes is emphasize how these ideas can be applicable to you, not just to large businesses. A lot of the examples that are used in the textbooks are about large businesses. Why is that? Well, because it's easy for textbook authors to get data on large businesses for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that large businesses oftentimes are publicly traded. And as publicly traded companies, they're regulated and they have to report information. And that reporting of information is easy for academics to get and harvest and use, as opposed to smaller businesses or individuals where it costs a lot of money to do individual research and things like that. And so a lot of the examples that are used in textbooks are about large businesses like Enron, WorldCom, and Tyco, which I told you about, is the reason that I was allowed to start developing this course and teach it, because when that ethical failure happened in business, all of a sudden AACSB and colleges of business became much more interested in this idea of promoting ethics. Because if you didn't, what would happen is you would likely have an economic or a regulatory backlash to the economic failures that business had created. So with modern ethical theory and utilitarianism, economists will tell you that what you want to do as an individual is you want to stretch your dollar as far as it can go. And this is obviously something that you all are familiar with, because we're facing, a lot of inflationary pressures that we haven't experienced in your lifetime. I actually remember a time when inflation was rampant in the late 1970s and early 1980s. I was a very young child, but I was interested in business. My mother owned a business. She had the second largest real estate company in New Mexico. She also was a contractor. She was a developer of commercial property, and so she built commercial properties. And she also had an art gallery. So she was kind of a serial entrepreneur. I was very interested in business as a child from a young age, because I admired my mother and I wanted to be just like her. And so I remember watching TV with my mother and them talking about interest rates, because if you're a realtor, that's obviously important, right? And we had hyperinflation and interest rates were sky high at that point in time. And we face similar situations now in terms of it's not as high as it was. I mean, at one point in time, I think home mortgage interest rates in the late 1970s and early 1980s hit almost 20%, which was just incredible. I mean, we think that 8% is just absolutely horrible, which is about what it is today. So imagine doubling that or even tripling it. And that's kind of what we faced in the 1970s and 1980s. Again, I was very young, but I do remember this. And so this hyperinflation that we've got, what does that mean for you? Well, it means that you want to get the most out of your dollar that you can, because you want to provide for yourself and your loved ones in the best way possible, right? So you want to stretch that dollar absolutely as far as you can. What does that mean? Well, it means that when you go to the grocery store, you're probably thinking about prices. What are some of the prices that are sky high right now? Well, eggs. And it's not just as a result of inflationary pressures that eggs are sky high. It's also a result of the fact that they've had to kill a lot of chickens that lay eggs because of bird flu, right? So anybody been to the store to buy eggs recently? They are crazy expensive. They're almost, I think I went into Walmart and the price in Walmart was almost, and we're not talking about heirloom eggs. My brother buys these heirloom eggs. There's a there's a grocery store in Texas called H-E-B. It's a very popular grocery chain down there. And that's the initials of the founder of the grocery chain. And they have all kinds of wonderful stuff, including heirloom eggs, which means that you can get chicken eggs that are blue and purple, not just white or brown. Like if you go to Walmart, you're pretty much limited to white or brown. Like they've got these ones that have spots on them, and they're over $1 an egg for those heirloom eggs. And he likes them because they have a different flavor to them than, corporately farmed eggs. And they were like $1 a year ago for those eggs, right? I admit they do taste different. If you're making omelets and things like that, it does add a different flavor to the product. But even non-heirloom eggs today, I went into Walmart and they were approaching $1 an egg. That's really, really incredible in terms of inflation. Whereas, even 6 months ago or less, eggs were expensive compared to what they were, pre-COVID. You could buy eggs for just almost nothing, like a couple of dollars for a dozen eggs, and now you're paying, about $1 an egg. So that's really hyperinflation. So what do you want to do? Well, you want to stretch your dollar as far as you can. What does that mean? Well, it means that you may be looking at other products for breakfast rather than eggs that will provide similar nutritional value as that egg. And it's really hard to do, actually. Eggs are kind of an ideal protein. But you might consider substitutes to eggs. Well, what are some of the substitutes for eggs? Well, I have an employee who's a vegan, and she insists that anything you can eat that's non-vegan, she can find a vegan substitute for. So they have egg-like substitutes, right? So that you can have the idea. Anybody tried them? Anybody tried vegan egg substitutes? They're in my opinion not very good, but they're getting better. Initially, like the meat substitutes for stuff were not terribly great. They're better. So you might consider some of these other alternatives, right? To stretch that dollar to get the most bang for your buck. Well, in ethical terms, we're not going to try and get the most bang for our buck. We're going to try and create the greatest happiness for the most number of people. Now, this is what makes it objective. It's not the greatest happiness for me or for you. You have to think about the greatest happiness for the most number of people. So it's not about creating happiness for me or my tribe or my family or my clan or whatever. It's about creating the most overall happiness. So actions, this is what we call a teleological theory of ethics. Actions are based and judged as being ethical or not based on the results that they achieve. And again, this is largely the basis of capitalism. We think that if you put things out in the market, the people who are most going to value a product or service the highest will put it to the highest and best use. And overall, that will produce the most amount of economic benefit for everybody. If I have some land and I want to sell the land, I'm going to put it on the market, and whoever buys it is probably the highest bidder is likely to use it for the best thing. Now, that's the theoretical basis, right? Now, it doesn't account for what we can call market failures. And there are examples of market failures, and then we have to think about what are we going to do to cure those market failures. But in ethical terms, what we're looking for is the greatest happiness for the most number of people, right? So what's wrong with this idea? Well, there are some things that we just kind of say that's creepy and you shouldn't do it at this point. If you, let's see if CNN still has this. CNN did this special a number of years ago on modern day slavery. Let's see if that'll play the video. And it's not going to play the video. Anyways, the title of it was How Ethical is Your Easter Basket? And it turns out that a lot of the world's chocolate is produced by close to slave labor, if not slave labor, on the west coast of Africa. Now, a small number of people are living in abhorrent conditions to produce enormous amounts of chocolate. In fact, in the video, they show this child who's involved, it's child labor in this, and they ask him, like, do you know what you are harvesting? And he says, no. He has no clue, has never tried chocolate. But you've got a small number of people in purely utilitarian terms. If you could use a small number of people and create enormous amount of happiness, and we know, happy for the most part. I mean, there are some people that don't really like chocolate, but for the most part, most of us like chocolate. And the things that happen in our brain when we eat chocolate, the chemicals that fire that indicate that you're experiencing pleasure, happen when you eat things like chocolate, right? We know that using fMRI technology. So you've got a small number of people who are living in abhorrent conditions, producing an enormous amount of happiness, and you could justify that on purely utilitarian terms, right? Because you're creating more happiness. And some economists do argue that that's, in fact, what happens. Like, that's part of development. That's what you have to have. And they point to the United States and say, look, this same thing happened in the US during the early parts of the Industrial Revolution. Who are you, the United States, to say you shouldn't do this when you yourself engaged in this kind of behavior? If you went back to the early parts of the Industrial Revolution, we had children working in sweatshops, in textile mills in the United States. And so there are people who argue that this is just part of, right, economic development and growth. And that as those countries modernize, what will happen? Well, that will end, right? But it's a necessary step towards the development. Well, some of us just think that's creepy. Like, you shouldn't do that. It's a priori wrong. Right? I've used this word before, a priori as opposed to a posteriori. Have I defined that word before for you? Yeah. It's rational mind versus T-O-R-I, which is information that's gained through the senses, right? A lot of us just think that this is creepy. You shouldn't do it. You shouldn't engage in child labor practices, no matter how much happiness you could produce out of it. It's just wrong. A second problem is, how do you calculate happiness? How do you do that? In simplistic situations, it's easy to calculate happiness. If you strip down a interaction between two people in an economic transaction, it's easy to calculate the happiness between those two people. But how do you project that out? So, for example, you all got here today. If we went back in time to the founding of the state of Oklahoma, which was not that long ago, right? Oklahoma was founded as a state a little more than 100 years ago. For those of you who went to high school in Oklahoma, how many of you went to high school in Oklahoma? Almost everybody. So you had to have Oklahoma history. One of the most boring history classes, because nothing happened in Oklahoma. I have come to dearly love the great state of Oklahoma, but that is a perversion I share only with consenting adults. It's just like, it was kind of the last place in the continental United States that anybody wanted to fight over. And so it's kind of a boring history, right? But for those of you who had to endure that boring history, and again, I love Oklahoma. I dearly love the great state of Oklahoma. When were we founded? What was our year of statehood? Anybody know?
1907.
1907. How did you know that? You just remembered this from?
Well, actually, I was talking about it this weekend with my mom.
Okay.
Because we were driving to Kansas.
So
Anyways, I don't.
1907 is when Oklahoma was founded. Like lots of the other states were founded, although in terms of like Western history, the United States is still a really young country, right? Like if we compare it to Greece or the Romans, Italy, the Roman Empire, we're a relatively new country, relatively young country. So 1907 is the year of statehood. That's when we were founded. You went back in time to 1907. And I remember when we had the 100-year anniversary of statehood. And I remember when we had the 100-year, I moved to Oklahoma in 1986. And I remember when we had the 100-year celebration of the land run, which was April 22nd, 1889. So in 1989, 3 years after we moved here, we had the celebration in Guthrie. Guthrie's where the land run office was, right? That's where people went and filed in that first land run that settled the central part of Oklahoma or the unassigned lands. So if you went back to 1889 or 1907, when we became a state, lots of people got around on horses. It's a kind of a miserable, I grew up on a cattle ranch. I had horses. I showed horses all my life. And I think they're a lot of fun. Wouldn't want to have to ride one to work every day, particularly on a day like today. And today might be a good day to ride a horse because it's not raining yet, but that's coming. So there's this guy who builds the first mass-produced automobile for the average person. Didn't come up with the first car, right? Henry Ford didn't come up with the first car. There were cars before Henry Ford, but they were largely luxury items for very wealthy people. They were a novelty. Henry Ford develops the first mass-produced automobile, the Model T. And it radically changes the way we go about moving around the country. It makes it really, really easy. In 1907, lots of people didn't go to college. Very few people went to college in the United States. Why? Well, most people lived out on the farm, and it was a long way to college. UCO started out before statehood. We were the first institution of higher education in Oklahoma Territory, the unassigned lands when it was open, and it was the Territorial Normal School. It was a institution to train teachers. And very few people went to school, went to college. Why? It was a long way off. And it was hard to get to. If you lived in Guthrie, you know, you weren't going to UCO every day because that would be an all-day horse ride from Guthrie to Edmond. Why is it that we have 77 counties in Oklahoma? Anybody know why? We have 77 counties. That's an enormous number of counties. Why is it that we have 77 counties? Because our Oklahoma founding fathers wanted to make sure that you could get to the county seat to conduct business from any place in the county by half a day's horse ride. So you could get to the county seat. For example, Guthrie, where I live, is in Logan County. You can get to the county seat, which is Guthrie, from any place in the county with about half a day's horse ride. Now we have these cars. Why am I bringing this up? Well, how would you evaluate the ethical results of the development of the car in terms of overall happiness? Are we happier today with cars than people in 1907?
In general, or
Overall, how do you calculate that?
you can't.
It's really hard to calculate. As a result of cars, we now have enormous amounts of pollution that is, whether or not you believe in anthropomorphic climate change, we know that the number of people suffering from severe allergies has increased. And a lot of that is because of the particulate matter that we are producing from carbon emissions. In the United States, when COVID happened, we all had to get used to, for a time, wearing these masks over our face, which were enormously uncomfortable, right? Like when they first started requiring that you wear masks to go in any business and stuff like that, it was like, oh my God. I mean, it's hard to breathe with these things on, right? And it was uncomfortable. There are places in the world where people, like, long before we had COVID, were wearing those masks as a result of the extreme pollution that is produced by carbon emissions and the amount of respiratory distress in those places. How do you measure that? How do you measure, excuse me, thank you. How do you measure overall happiness as a result of the fact that Henry Ford invented this product that has now become so necessary that we all drive one? And I will admit, I can live in Guthrie and teach at UCO, and isn't that great? It doesn't take a day and a half ride for me to get here. My law partner, who passed away a couple years ago, was not that old. He passed away at 65. But his mother, when they decided that they needed to get her a better education so she could go to college, they lived on a farm. And because they couldn't get in cars, even though the cars back then were not, they had a car, but it wasn't great in terms of transportation. They actually sent her to live with a family in Guthrie so that she could get a better education and go to college. And then when she went to college, she came here to UCO, which was called, I think, Central State at the time she came, and she actually boarded with a family in Edmond. Because that was going from a farm outside of Guthrie to Edmond every day was just not something people did, even with the cars that they had back then. So, you know, like I got in my car this morning, I didn't have any doubt that it was gonna start. You did with the Ford Model T, right? Maybe doubt that it was gonna start and it was gonna make it to UCO. Versus we have people like having all of these allergy problems. People who don't smoke are dying of lung cancer. I've known 3 that have never smoked. Why are they developing lung cancer? Well, it's probably from, you know, I mean, they hypothesize it's from the amount of particulate emissions. And we don't live in an area that has particularly high levels compared to other places like Los Angeles. It was incredible during the COVID crisis to look at what happened to the air over Los Angeles from before COVID, where the number of days that you could not see the top of the skyline in Los Angeles, not as a result of rain or clouds, but as a result of smog. And it completely like went away during COVID. I mean, how do you calculate this, right? How do you calculate the greatest happiness? And then there's this problem of the ends, you know, like maybe we shouldn't do that. Well, so a second form of utilitarianism pops up to try and fix. The first and original form of utilitarianism is what we can call act utilitarianism. So what act utilitarianism says is that in every interaction, we have to think about in everything that we do, what is going to produce the overall greatest good. Now, this is going to be really, really taxing for people to do, right? To try and come up with overall happiness, you know, like on a minute by minute basis, to constantly have to do the calculus. And then again, as I said, if we think about cars, right? Would you say that Henry Ford is if we decided that we could actually calculate overall happiness, so we're gonna detract or we're gonna subtract out, we're gonna subtract the misery created by cars versus the happiness created by cars. And what we hope is that there's a positive balance at the end, right? That's gonna be really, really hard to do, isn't it? I mean, how are we even gonna calculate the fact that, okay, so we've got this thing called a car and it's created an ability to move around much easier, but it's also created an enormous amount, particularly for my generation, for example, an enormous amount of anxiety. Now, I've noticed that it's created less anxiety for your generation because it's amazing to me how many of your generation didn't want to drive. Like how many of you just didn't care about anybody not get a driver's license at 16 in here? You didn't get a driver's license at 16? I have lots of friends who's like, everyone in my high school class got a driver's license at 16. Like most of us, the day we turned 16, went down and got a driver's license. And not only did we go down and get a driver's license, but almost all of us had a car. Now, for some people, that meant that they worked really, really hard to buy that car. My best friend, his parents were not going to buy him a car. He wanted a car, he needed to buy. So he started mowing when he was 13 years old, started mowing yards for the neighbors and built up a yard business so that when he turned 16, he could buy a car. And if you didn't have a car when you turned 16, where I went to, like, there was this, like, what's wrong with you? Everybody had a car. Now, what that car looked like, I mean, so there's an enormous amount of anxiety that was created by the need for this device, right? How do you measure that? How do you measure that? So in order to deal with this problem of trying to constantly do the calculus in our head, a second form of utilitarianism comes up along called rule utilitarianism. And what it does is it attempts to fix the problem with act utilitarianism. So what we can say is we'll develop rules that maybe in a specific instance don't lead to the greatest happiness, but in the aggregate will lead to the greatest happiness overall. Right? So we're trying to come up with rules. So what are some of the rules? Well, like, don't engage in child labor, even though in a specific instance, using child labor to produce chocolate produces an overall, on the whole, by and large, if we did this, if we allowed for this, it wouldn't produce the most happiness. You would have enormous amounts of children that are living in a perpetuated state of poverty as a result of the fact that they're not going and getting an education. Why is it that we don't have that state in the United States? Well, we started saying kids can't go to work in the textile mills, they have to go to school. We passed laws that said children have to go to school and get an education up to a certain point, right? And in the United States, that generally means that you go through 12 grades of school. And that has resulted in a large middle class because you have people that are fairly educated, right? So in the specific instance, maybe if we went back to child labor, we would produce more happiness because we would have cheaper goods. But in the aggregate, over time, we've produced this rule that says, don't do that, and we're going to send kids to school. And over a long period of time, what we've done is we've created overall maybe more happiness, right? So we'll come up with rules that take away the need to think about the calculus in every single situation that we have. So we no longer have to sit around and think about this constantly. Now, what's the problem with rule utilitarianism? Just like act utilitarianism has problems, there's problems with rule utilitarianism. First of all, again, even if we come up with rules that seem to produce overall greatest happiness, how do you really measure that? How do we actually measure it? Well, we try to do it through public policy analysis, right? And engaging in good public policy. But the second problem is can you develop a rule for every situation? As soon as you develop a rule, there will be what to the rule? There will be exceptions to the rule, right? We do this all the time. We have exceptions to rules. In criminal law, we call these affirmative defenses, which are exceptions to the rules. So generally speaking, in the criminal law, there are two types of laws that we impose that attach criminal liability to them. The most important of these is called malum in se. M-A-L-U-M-I-N-S-E, malum in se. These are rules that we impose that we think are based on some kind of higher morality. What's that? Murder at common law was defined as the unlawful killing of a human being with malice aforethought. This is what we call an elements test in law. So there are factors tests and there are elements tests in law. So if an elements test is hard, you have to meet every element of the test. So murder At common law was defined as the unlawful killing human being, malice aforethought. Unlawful killing human being, malice aforethought. You had to have every element. So it has to be an unlawful killing. What's a lawful killing? War is a lawful killing. A peace officer engaged in the course of his duty could be a lawful killing. So it has to be unlawful killing, they have to die, of a human being, malice aforethought. That's the elements, right, of the test. Now, the reason I point this out is because in rule utilitarianism, we're going to come up with a rule that says don't engage in child labor. And then just as soon as you have that rule, there are probably going to be exceptions to that rule. For most of our nation's history, kids lived out on a farm. The vast majority of people were rural. They lived out on a farm. Well, how do you tell parents that they can't have their kid engaged in working the farm? We still have remnants of this today. The reason that we have summer break in the United States is a relic of the past when the vast majority of people lived on a farm and they needed to work the farm in the summertime, right? Because that's when you, in the spring and summer, that's when you plant and then in the fall harvest crops, right? So we let kids off of school. Is that really a good idea from a learning perspective? No. What happens to childhood development over those months that they are off from school? Well, they lose a lot of stuff and then you have to reteach it, right? So there are school systems in Oklahoma City. I don't know if they still do this. Anybody have kids in Oklahoma City public schools? I usually have like one person who has a child. Oklahoma City actually went to year-round school at one point in time. I'm not sure if they still do it or not, but they went to year-round school. And the idea is that's actually better for learning. You don't lose all of this stuff by having this 3-month block in the summer when you're off. Well, that was necessary, right? So we have this rule, kids need to go to school, but the minute we come up with the rule, well, you have all of these kids that live out on the farm and their parents need them to work. So we're gonna have 3 months off, right? So you start coming up with exceptions to the rule. We have a rule, you know, don't kill. It's based on criminal law. Malum say, we think of this as being higher morality. Like that's something that has moral import to it, right? As opposed to malum prohibitum. P-R-O-H-I-B-I-T-U-M, malum prohibitum. These are things that we say have criminal import, but it's not like we say that you're a bad person if you do this. What are some of the things that are like malum prohibitum? Well, we have these things called stop signs that go back to the car example, right? As we got more and more cars, initially when Ford developed the Model T, there weren't stop signs in towns, in streets. And all of a sudden people are, you know, like at intersections running into each other. And so we had to come up with stop signs. And if you run the stop sign, we don't say you're an evildoer. It is a violation of the criminal law, but it's not based on moral import. It's just, we have to have this in order to have an orderly society. But again, every time we come up with a rule, there are exceptions to the rule. What's an exception to you have to stop at the stop sign? Well, if you have an emergency, you're trying to get your heart attack patient to the hospital, do you have to stop at the stop sign? No, you can run it. And there's an exception, right? Like emergency situations. The ambulance runs the stop sign all the time, right? So the problem with rule utilitarianism is the same as like the law. Every time we come up with a law and we say this is the law, well, there's exceptions, right? The unlawful killing human being, malice aforethought. If someone breaks into your home and they are threatening you and your family, You may kill them in the state of Oklahoma, right? That is a lawful killing. There's an exception to that. Now, some states say that's not an exception to it. Almost all states say that you have self-defense, right? But where you have to retreat to is a matter of interpretation. So for example, my brother lived in New York. They have a self-defense law in New York. It's not like Oklahoma. And in New York, you have a duty and obligation, as I understand the law there, unless it's changed. You have a duty. You can't just, if somebody comes into your house, you can't just shoot them and assume that they present a threat. You have to retreat until you can get no further, right? You have to retreat. It's called retreat to the wall. So there are all of these exceptions once we come up with a rule, and that's a problem. But again, utilitarianism is valid because it's based on reason. What's the reason? It's not my happiness, it's overall happiness, right? We can come up with universal rules that are applicable at all places at all times in all situations, right? It doesn't allow for exceptionalism. It doesn't allow for you to say, I'm special, my group is special. But there are these problems with utilitarianism that we might say the ends don't always justify the means. And then how do we calculate happiness? Even if we take the rule utilitarian perspective, how do we calculate happiness with the rule utilitarian perspective? Well, the rules may fail. And so what do we do when the rules fail? Well, you come up with exceptions to the rules, or you come up with new rules. You have constant reform of the rules, right? If we think of ethics in Hegelian terms, where we have a thesis and then an antithesis, so we have utilitarianism, a modern antithesis to utilitarianism as proposed by Immanuel Kant is duty ethics. And like utilitarianism, there are two types. It takes two forms. The oldest form is called religious absolutism, and the form proposed by Kant is called religious or rational absolutism, as opposed to religious absolutism. So with religious absolutism, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to turn to the book. What does the book say? Well, what's the problem with using religious absolutism as the basis for our ethical theories in business? Well, we operate on a global perspective right now, right? On a global economy. And whose book are we going to use? Even if we decided, for example, that, well, in the United States, the vast majority of people identify as Christian, we're a democratic nation, so we'll use a religious absolutist perspective. We'll engage in democracy, and we'll have a Christian, basis of our ethics in business. Well, which version of the book are we going to look at? Are they the same amongst all denominations? No. The Catholic Bible is different than the Protestant Bible, right? Where did the Protestant Bible originate? Well, the most widely used version of the Protestant Bible is the King James Version. Maybe the only document ever produced by a committee that was any good. There's the New International Version, which attempts to sort of distill archaic language into modern, vernacular. Whose book are we going to use, right? So Kant comes up with something called rational absolutism that he thinks fixes this problem, and it fixes the problem with utilitarianism. Kant says we can't look at results because results vary widely. How do you do this calculus? And then let's think about not just how do you do the calculus, but how many of you have done things in your life that you had a good intent and it turned out really poorly for you and everybody involved. My brother and I like to cook. I started cooking at an early age. And normally when you start cooking at an early age, you should have parental supervision, right? I was a kid who got up every morning. I get up at 5 a.m. every day. That's just my internal clock. That's how I was as a child. From my earliest memories, I was one that got up early. My parents were not people that got up early. And I can remember as a child going into my parents' room at a very early age, very young age, and saying, I'm hungry. And my mother would say, just let me sleep for another hour. And I'm like, it's your responsibility to feed me. Well, as a result of that, I started learning to cook for myself at a very early age. My brother and I decided one Sunday morning, as my parents were sleeping, that we would make them breakfast. We had the best of intention. And what do you have for breakfast? Well, eggs. That's good. And bacon. Like, that's really good, right? So we're making eggs and bacon. And what happens when you make bacon on the stovetop? Well, you can start a grease fire pretty easily with bacon on the stovetop. And in fact, that's what happened. We started a grease fire, which resulted in the fire alarms throughout the house going off. We had the best of intention. From a utilitarian perspective, they would say that's bad, because the results that followed from those actions were bad. It meant that my parents were woken up by the fire alarms going off. The house was filled with smoke. We had to air out the house. That's not good for the walls in the kitchen, the ceilings, all kinds of things, right? It's overall bad. But our intentions were good. And Kant would say, if you have a good mind, that's what really counts. You can't judge the act by what happens, because sometimes people act in really good ways or what they think are good ways, and bad things happen. So what we need to do is we need to come up with rules, duties that we can apply, and whether bad results happen is irrelevant. We're going to base it on whether or not we followed the duties that we have discerned using rational comprehensive thought. So what is it that Kant says we have to do? Well, you have to act in such a way as to wish your action was a universal maxim of law. You have to be able to act in such ways to say, I would want everybody else to have to act this way in all places at all times in this situation. Well, what does that mean? Always treat a rational being as an end in and of themselves and never as a means to an end. Now, what does that mean? Well, one of the examples that you can get out of Kant is never lie. Never lie. Why can't you lie? Because when you lie, you are manipulating somebody and you are treating them as a means to an end rather than an end in and of themselves. Never lie. Now, this is the one, and this is the reason why business people don't like it and why they prefer utilitarianism. Never lie. Never lie. Is it ever acceptable to lie in business? Is it ever acceptable to lie in business? We're going to have a negotiation competition as part of our sales competition coming up here in March at the Challenger Sales Institute. And part of negotiations involves these teams of students trying to reach an agreement based on a set or a fact pattern that we give them, right? And we see how well they work with their team member to achieve solutions and how well they work with other people to achieve solutions. These are usually what economists will call games of complete but imperfect information, like the prisoner's dilemma. The game is complete because you know what the possibilities are, right? In the prisoner's dilemma, how many of you have heard of the prisoner's dilemma from game theory? None of you have heard of the prisoner's dilemma? So in game theory, let's suppose you have, and economists use this as an illustration to highlight a point that happens in market failures and many times, and it's based on historical precedent. You have two prisoners that commit a crime together, or that are accused of committing a crime together. Let's say burglary. Burglary is defined at the common law, it's again an elements test, as the breaking, entering the dwelling house of another with an intent to commit a felony therein, right? That's burglary. Have to meet every element of the test, right? So generally speaking, burglary involves, what's the felony therein that most people commit? Theft. Right? That's generally what most people do when they burgle a house. So you have these two people that are accused of burglary. The evidence against them is completely circumstantial, but the police have enough evidence to arrest them and detain them and question them. And so what are they going to do when they do this? Are they going to keep them together in the same room? No. They're going to break them up, right? They're going to break these two people up. They're going to put them in different rooms, and they're going to say, your buddy's about to talk. The first one to talk gets the deal, right? So the prisoner's dilemma is, and it's a game of complete but imperfect information, because what are the possibilities? Well, you have prisoner one and prisoner two, and the possibilities are talk, silent, right? And the possibility is talk, silent. Now let's suppose that if one of them talks, they'll get a lighter sentence than the other, right? And for burglary, let's say that the maximum sentence at law is 10 years. But if you talk, you're going to get a lighter sentence, and they're going to give you 6 years, right? So let's say that prisoner one talks and prisoner two is silent. So prisoner two is going to get a sentence of 10 years. Prisoner one is going to get a sentence of 6 years. And the same over here. If prisoner one remains silent, they're going to get 10 years, and prisoner two is going to get 6 years, right? If they both remain silent, let's say that they can't convict them of burglary, but they can convict them of possession of stolen property, which only carries a sentence of 3 years, right? Because that's the way they have it, is they've caught them with this stolen property. And of course, the prisoners, when they're caught with the stolen property, use the some dude defense. When I practiced criminal law, I had lots of people who did this. They would have something that was stolen, and the police would say, where'd you get it? Some dude gave it to me. The some dude defense. I didn't take it. Like, some dude gave it to me. I was just standing around on the street corner, and some dude handed me a car radio. Nobody steals car radios anymore. I don't know why. That was when I was a kid growing up, that was a big thing. People stole car radios. They actually had radios that were called face-offs, so that you would take the face off the radio so that it wasn't worth anything. If they stole it, you would take the face plate off of it, which controlled the radio. You've never even seen these, have you? No, right? That was a big deal, right? So like, you're standing around like, I don't know, the police catch you with this, this stolen radio. I don't know, some dude gave it to me. I was just standing around outside the post office. Some dude just walked up and said, hey, you want a radio? So they can get them for stolen property, which carries 3. Where do they both end up? Well, they both end up always at talk. Why? It's complete but imperfect, because you don't know what your fellow accomplice is doing, right? And so you assume that they're going to talk, and you talk, and you both end up worse off, right? Where do you always end up? Here. Where do you want to end up? Here. Well, this is like negotiations. Businesses oftentimes don't reveal their hand because they want to get a better advantage, right? So in negotiations, what will they do? What will they do in negotiation? They'll lie, right? This is highlighted by a movie called Pretty Woman. How many of you have seen this movie? It's a rather old movie, right? So Richard Gere is an arbitrageur, right? And there's an old saying that says, give a man a fish, you'll feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish, you'll feed him for a lifetime. Teach a man to arbitrage, and you will feed him and his family for generations. So Richard Gere plays this part of an arbitrageur in Pretty Woman, and he goes to dinner with a company. Now, what he does as an arbitrageur is he buys companies and he breaks them up because they're worth more as little parts than they are as a whole, right? So he breaks them up and sells them off. And he goes to dinner with this guy who's the owner of the company. And the guy says, look, I'll buy back your shares for a profit. And I've got these Navy contracts. And Richard Gere says, no, you don't. You don't have Navy contracts. Those are dead. And the guy says, what? You've got dirty politicians in your back pocket? And Richard Gere says, yep, Senator so-and-so says those are dead. And turns out later on in the movie, as a result of having this, this relationship with the Julia Roberts character, who's the Pretty Woman character, he sees the light, right? Richard Gere sees the light, and he decides that he's going to change his ways. And he now wants to help the guy rather than taking over his business, breaking it up and selling it off into little pieces. He's going to help him, and he's going to help him build back. And the guy says, well, how is this going to be possible with our ship contracts being obliterated by you and Senator so-and-so? And he says, they weren't really, they were just delayed. And the guy says, you were bluffing? And Richard Gere says, yeah, I was bluffing. And he says, well, you were very good at it. And Richard Gere says, yeah, it's my job. So never lie in business? Is it acceptable to lie? Kant would say no. Because when you're lying, you're manipulating people, right? Never lie. Never lie.
It's not acceptable.
Right? Somebody asks you, how do I look? You look like hell. Right? Like, no, we don't do that, right? Now, what's wrong with this idea of duty ethics? What are some of the problems with duty ethics? Well, I think most of us would say, for example, when the Nazis come knocking on the door, where are the Jews? Kant would say, give Anne Frank up. She's upstairs in the attic. Most of us would say, no. Right? Like, no. That's way too harsh. And I think if you started to press Kant, now we can't because he's dead, but I think if you started to press him and say, why is it that you can't lie? I think he would say, because if we thought that people were lying all the time, we could never build a society, right? And ultimately, doesn't that mean that results count? Doesn't it ultimately mean that results count? The other problem with duty ethics is it provides no guidance for dealing with conflicting duties. For example, in the example of the hypothetical of the inquiring murderer, the people who are looking for the Jews, they're looking for Anne Frank. The Nazis show up at the door, where are the Jews? It would be perfectly consistent to say, you can have a duty that says don't lie, but what if you have another duty? It would be perfectly logically consistent to say, you should never participate in the unlawful killing of another human being. And by participating in telling the Nazis where she is, you're participating. I mean, those are two logically consistent duties. What do you do if you have a confliction between the two duties? Kant doesn't tell us how to deal with that, right? Again, it allows for universally applicable development of rules, no exceptions, based on reason, so it's a valid ethical theory, but there are problems with it, right? Which is why I think that virtue ethics by Aristotle, and we talked about this a little bit, is a wonderful modern or a wonderful moderate ground between the two. So according to Aristotle in virtue ethics, what we do is we come up with a list of virtues that we want to instill, right? And based on those virtues, rather than worrying about what to do in a particular situation, we try to create a holistic human being. And I'm out of time, so we'll finish this next time and talk about corporate social responsibility. And then I think the exam is the following week, so I'll talk about that as well and what to do on that. So I am out of time. You got one duck today. Posting link in the live stream.